Hello everyone, I'm Lindsay from Happy Hour Stitches, and I'm so excited to share an easy method for adding labels to your quilts. Adding labels to your quilt is not only a great way to remember details of your quilt years after you've finished it, but it can also serve as a meaningful and important way to pass down information about your quilts to future generations. And while adding labels to your quilts can seem like a tedious last step of the quilting process, especially when you're so close to having a finished quilt, it doesn't have to be hard. So let's dive into the process. The first thing we want to do when making our quilt label is cut a square of fabric. I have cut a 7 by 7 inch square of fabric, but you can cut any size that feels right for your quilt. So if it's a smaller quilt, you may want to cut a 5 by 5 inch square. If it's larger or you have a lot you want to write on your label, you might want to do larger than this. So I've chosen a fabric that matches my backing fabric here. So it's pulling in this lighter pink. I wanted to choose a lighter color and also one that was going to be easy to read when I write on this with my pen. So choosing a lighter color makes sure that what I'm writing shows up. So you just want to consider that when you're choosing your backing fabric. Once we have our square cut, we're going to fold it in half diagonally with our right sides out. And then we're just going to give this a little finger press. I'm actually going to take this over to my ironing board and press it just to make it nice and flat. So I have this nicely pressed, as you can see here. So it's two-sided right now, folded into that triangle. And I'm going to show you my favorite way to write on fabric. So my absolute favorite tool is the Pigma Micron pen. This is archival ink, so it's safe to use on fabric. I like using black in the 05, which is 0.45 millimeter tip here. I've tried a lot of different thicknesses and I find this one to be the smoothest for writing, but you can try a variety and see what you like. And I am actually going to mark lines on my fabric for me to follow, just like lines on a piece of paper would have, so that I can ensure my writing is straight. But you don't have to do that. You can just write on the fabric as you would like. You can also, if you're unsure of your handwriting, print your message onto paper and then put this over a light box with the paper and trace your message onto here. So I'm going to show you how I mark my lines. So I like to use a clover hair marker to mark crease lines in my fabric. I find it very easy to use. So I am going to mark 4 lines on this fabric because I have 4 lines of writing I need to get down here. We're treating this fold as the top of our writing and we're going down from here. So I am just going to, let me step over to the side here. We want to make sure we're leaving at least 1/2 inch of room on all sides, just because we're going to end up stitching this into our binding. So we don't want our writing to get too close to the edge. So I'm going to mark my first line 1 inch down from the top. I'm just going to use my hair marker to just mark a little crease line, as you can see here, so I can follow that when I'm writing. And then from there, I'm just going to do 1/2 inch spacing. So we'll do 3 more lines, 1/2 inch spacing, but you choose the spacing that feels right for you. And these crease lines are so easy to iron out when we're done. So we're just using these as a guide and then they'll iron out when we're done. And now I'm just going to use my Micron pen to write the words I want on my quilt label. I'm going to try my best to keep it as centered as possible, but I'm not going to be worried about being too perfect here. This writes pretty smoothly, but it does require you just to go over it a few times. So I like to do short little strokes to make sure everything is coming out really smooth and clean. Here's what I've done adding all my information. It's mostly centered. I got a little off on that top. But here's the information I included, but yours can be absolutely different. So the quilt I'm binding right now documents a year of reading I did for the year of 2024. So I just kind of put the occasion for making the quilt on top. The second line is Book Club Quilt, which is the pattern I made. So I did document that. Now this is my own pattern design, but if I had made someone else's design, I might also put the designer on here as well. And then Lindsay is my name, and then this is the date I finished it. So you can add whatever information you think is important, but I like to usually include this information on my quilt. Now the most important step when we're making labels, if we're using a micron pen like I did, is we need to set the ink. So to do this, we just press on top of it using a dry iron at high heat. So no steam, no water, anything in your iron. And you're just gonna hold it on top of it for a few seconds. And this just sets the ink so it's not gonna bleed, it's not gonna fade, it's not gonna wash out. And doing this also helps remove those crease lines that we added. And because we're doing this, no matter how many times you wash it, no matter how much use it gets, this label is going to stay intact. So once we're done with that, we're going to sew this into our quilt during the binding process. Now it's time to sew our label to the back of our quilt. So I'm in the middle of binding this quilt top, and I've chosen a bottom corner. You want to do a bottom corner of your quilt because otherwise your label is going to be upside down. I'm just going to position this label on a bottom corner with my raw edges of the label aligned with the edges of my quilt top, and that fold is going to cut through the center. And once we have it in place, I'm going to pin it in place. I just have some Wonder clips here, but you can use pins if you want. You could even use a little bit of glue, washable glue, if you just want to stick it in place. So I'm just going to stick a few pins in here, clips to hold everything in place. And then as I bind, I will be sewing through all those raw edges here to hold it in place. And then when I hand bind the quilt, it'll cover those raw edges completely. And then I'll show you how to finish this edge in a minute. So let's take this over to my machine and get sewing. I'm at my machine. I am stitching my binding on, and I have my label clipped to the back. So as I start to stitch my binding, I'm just going to make sure that my label is lying flat so it's not tucked over in any way, and I'll remove the clips as I come to them. I'm just binding like I normally would with any quilt. Okay, I've reached my corner, so here's what it looks like. You can see it's all sewed into place now. Our label is almost sewed to the back. So let's miter our corners and sew that other edge. Our binding is sewed onto the front, so you can see those stitches held our label in place. And then as you sew your back of the binding on, whether you're doing that by hand or machine, I like to do it by hand, it will cover up those stitch lines and hide all those raw edges of your label, and you'll have a nice label on the back. I will come through here as well and hand stitch this folded edge down. Now I will say, if you're giving your quilt away as a gift, or if it's a quilt that you think will get a lot of use, you can actually hide a few scraps of fabric in this little pocket the label creates. So if you ever do need to do any repairs, you'll have the fabric on hand to just, do little repairs to the binding or the front of the quilt if needed. So that's a fun little tip in case you want to do that. So I'll be back when I'm done with my hand stitching to show you the final look and to show you what it looks like when this is hand stitched down. So I've been hand binding my quilt here, and I've just left the binding unsewn around where my label is. And I like to sew this loose fold down before I finish the binding because it just is easier to get to when you don't have the binding in the way of the end of your label. So I sew it down by hand just like I would do binding. So I take just a little stitch into the backing right underneath the label, and then I just travel through the fold in between both layers of fabric, and I come up about 1/4 inch away and just take a stitch. That's how I do it. If you do binding a different way, you can use that method. And I'll just continue all the way across until it's sewn down. So I have the fold sewn down as you can see here, and now I'm just sewing the rest of my binding down to cover those raw edges. I just wanted to show you the process. It's not anything different than how you would normally sew your binding down, except it might feel a little different because you're going through kind of looser fabric because it's not quilted down. So it might feel like it's harder to get through because you're just pulling the fabric a little bit because it's not secured down with quilting. And every once in a while, I try to only go through the top layer of our label, although our label is 2 fabrics thick because we folded it. So every once in a while, you might feel your needle going through both of the fabrics, so it might feel a little tougher to pull through, but that's all normal. It's okay. And so we just finish our binding and then our label is done. Wasn't that so easy? Quilt labels are a great way to personalize your quilts and make sure that the quilt history is passed down to others. So I hope you give this technique a try, and thank you so much for joining me for Happy Hour.